Avinash calls us Huntley and Brinkley. It's probably only about 5 people who can remember who they were. No, there are probably more.
If they start arguing, they may get into tag team.
So I'm going to cede the second half of my talk to, this is all joint work. I'm going to cede the second half of my talk to Avinash, and then he's going to cede the second half of his talk to me. So the title of my talk is Evolution in Public Goods. And I started out by realizing that what I call public goods and what Steve Allison and other ecologists call public goods was not exactly the same thing as what economists call public goods. I actually first realized that when I was talking to Don about some public goods, and he says, you know, economists wouldn't not all necessarily think of those as public goods. So I went to Wikipedia, which is obviously the source. And I said, in economics, a public good is a good. Economists are good to define things in terms of themselves. That is non-rivalrous, and meaning that we don't compete for it, and non-excludable, meaning it's open to everybody. And this means that consumption of the good by one individual does not reduce the availability of the good for consumption by others, and no one can be effectively excluded from using the good. And Samuelson has the purest definition. These are goods which everybody enjoys in common in the sense that each individual's consumption leads to no subtraction from any other individual's consumption. So, like clean air to a first approximation. Although, whenever we do anything in the air, we affect each other, and so Wikipedia goes on to say, in the real world, there may not be any such thing as an absolutely non-rivaled and non-excludable good, but economists think that some goods approximate the concept closely enough for the analysis to be economically useful. And then they had a table, and I'm not going to defend where things are in this table. When I sent some of these things to Avinash, he thought they should be in different categories. One of the things I found most confusing is they talk about public goods, and there are 4 different categories of public goods, one of which are called public goods. So that cleared it up for me. So clearly there are private goods, things we buy and have for our own use. These are rivalrous. You use it, somebody else can't use it, and they're excludable, and you have to pay to have them. And then there are things they call club goods, like satellite television, that are not rivalrous, but they're excludable. You have to pay to get them, but anybody can get them. There are common goods, which are in the literature often called common pool resources. And I'm not sure that Avinash would put these here, but nor did I put them here, but it's like fishing grounds. I think he'd be comfortable with that, hunting, game, etc. And then there are real public goods, like freedom to air, national defense, etc. I'm going to tend to use, and I think in the context of this meeting, people have been using public goods in a rather broad sense to include all of these things. But I want to recognize that in the literature, that's not always the case. Avinash and I are also going to distinguish between 2 categories, which basically deals with the rivalry issue and non-rivalry issue. If something is rivalrous, in ecology, I think it's close to what we call contest competition, where 2 individuals compete over some resource or mates or something of that sort, and one person ends up winning it. So that's obviously a rivalrous situation, and in economics, it's close to, what did you call it, in the market?
Competition for the market.
For the market, and typically ending up with a monopoly. Congestion is what ecologists think of as scramble competition. This is the non-rivalrous form. So you have lots of deer that go out and are foraging on a grassland, and they're all, if they're twice as many, each one gets half as much. It's not that half of them get exactly as much and the other half gets 0. And in some situations, this can make a big difference, and this leads to an oligopoly situation. So this has big implications, actually, in ecology, because What it means is if you're dealing with a rival resource and you have a certain, let's say a certain number of sites that birds can occupy, then the population size is roughly fixed by the number of available sites. If you have twice as many birds, half of them won't get anything. On the other hand, if you're dealing, if you introduce twice as many deer into our backyard, then eventually they'll all starve to death. So it can make a big difference. I'll come back to that later, probably in the second half of the talk. Now, in thinking about environmental goods, some of the sorts of things that I'm thinking about and that got me interested in this would be, for example, in this category, access to lakefront. Swine flu vaccine, you may not have thought of putting that up there, but Carol and I couldn't get our swine flu vaccine until we came out here because it was not made available to people over 65. So it's excludable and also rivalrous. There were a limited number of doses, and you have to pay a little bit, but that wasn't the big issue. But we were told we were not allowed to receive it. So that really fit up, I think, under this category. National parks, I put down here because you have to pay to get in and you have to have money to get there, but you can be effectively excluded from them. Maybe it doesn't belong down here. These things we talked about before, climate, for example, is a real public good. Herd immunity, for those who don't know what I mean by that, that means you're protected if 95% of the people in the population get vaccinated against a particular disease that's going around. That creates herd immunity, which is a collective good. I put antibiotic effectiveness up here. Maybe it should go down here because we use it up. Every time you get antibiotics, you're introducing those antibiotics into the pool, and that reduces the effectiveness of antibiotics. So some of these things you might think of in terms of public bads, antibiotic resistance. I've thought of them, translated them into goods, antibiotic effectiveness, and there's just so much antibiotic effectiveness out there, and every time we get shots, we potentially use it up. Now, there I'm talking about the application of these sorts of ideas to ecological and environmental problems. But I want to make a separate category, which is what Steve Allison will talk about and a lot of what Steve Frank talked about yesterday, which is problems in evolution. And these are different because I'm not talking about our managing a situation. I'm talking about how evolution has solved these problems. So this is a paper by an indirect collaborator of mine, Francisco Dionisio. I'm not necessarily advocating this paper, but he specifically talks about these concepts of rivalry and excludability in dealing with public goods problems in evolutionary biology. So most of you heard Steve's excellent talk yesterday, and so you saw lots of examples. Some of them I'll revisit today and some new ones. But I think a honeycomb or a termite's nest, termite mound, all represent a kind of public good in which individuals build something together and then share in it. So in evolution, there are a number of different kinds of categories of goods. Females compete for mates, so mates become basically private goods, depending on what's going on in the population. These are excludable and rivalrous. Parasites compete for hosts. Steve talked about extracellular proteins that are emitted out into the population and become a kind of public good. And then there are things we all share like sunlight and water quality. And I mentioned allelochemics yesterday. I'll talk some more about these today in case you don't know what they are. To first approximation, I treat these as non-rivalrous. These are things, chemicals which individuals spew into the population to poison competitors. So if I put it out there, you benefit from it if you're nearby, as long as you're not affected by it, and therefore you don't have to pay the price. So evolution has dealt with all these kinds of problems as well. And we'd like to, Avinash largely will present the framework, the general framework that we've got. Now what we really are having trouble doing is tying this down to specific applications. So an important part of public goods, an important part of the models that we will discuss is what's called prosociality, namely how much you care about other individuals. Now where does that come from? Well, you may not want to think of altruism among closely related individuals as pro-sociality, but certainly individuals care about other individuals in an evolutionary sense. So when I say care about here, when we're talking about humans making decisions or other animals making decisions, they may actually care about them. But evolutionarily, this could arise as well. Now I can't remember whether you talked about Hamilton. We certainly talked about Hamilton yesterday. Bill Hamilton solved the problem of why females, or at least provided a solution to the problem of why females are willing to give up their fitness in the haplodiploid insects to help others raise offspring. In particular, they help their sisters raise offspring. And since in the bees, the ants, and the wasps, the males come from unfertilized eggs, females who have the same father and mother are related in 3/4 of their gene. So that close genetic relatedness makes important something called inclusive fitness, which I'll actually put a formula up for a moment. Inclusive fitness applies even in diploid organisms. It's just that the genetic relatedness is less, and therefore the force is less strong. So Hamilton worked all of this out and showed why females should give up their fitness for their sisters, as long as they could have more than a 4/3 bang for the buck. They were going to compensate for giving up their own fitness. Now, there's lots of work, and my brother, who's a beekeeper, tells me, not all the females in the nest are real sisters. And as Steve pointed out to us yesterday, genetic relatedness is far from the whole story, but it's an explanation. Reciprocal altruism is another. So to deal with this, one replaces the notion of fitness, which would be associated with an organism, namely in terms of the number of offspring it will produce or the number of viable offspring, etc., by something called the inclusive fitness, which is the individual's fitness plus the fitness of all other individuals multiplied by the relatedness of those individuals, namely the number of genes they share by descent, summed up. So this is your total fitness. It's how much you get directly plus how much you benefit from what others are getting. And this becomes, this is the simplest version, but this becomes the relevant concept in thinking about these relatedness issues. Well, in economics, we would replace fitness with utility, and we might take into account something called the inclusive utility, which is your utility plus the utility of everybody else in the population, weighted by how much you care about them, how much their fitness means to you. So this is the term we call pro-sociality. And that's going to be essential in what Avinash is going to talk about. Now, organisms produce public goods. They produce substances that chelate things that you don't want in the system. Steve talked about siderophores yesterday, which have to do with iron. Organisms fix nitrogen. Fixing nitrogen produces a public good which leaks out and is available for everybody. It's taking nitrogen out of the air, for example, out of the soil, and putting it into a form that's usable by organisms. You have to transform it. Costs you something to do that, but then you benefit from it, but so do other individuals potentially in your neighborhood. Antibiotics are produced by organisms. I'm not talking about the antibiotics you get from your doctor, although they're derived from these. But penicillin occurs naturally in the wild. That's how we discover it. And organisms produce those. They poison enemies, and therefore, if you're nearby somebody who's poisoning an enemy, you benefit. Extracellular proteins, Steve talked about. I'll come back and say a little bit more about those that are produced. So this is pretty close to the same slide Steve showed yesterday. My colleague, Bonnie Bassler, actually collaborated because we've published some together on this, calls herself the queen of quorum sensing. So bacteria produce substances that carry out a number of different roles. They form a matrix. They signal other organisms. Steve talked a lot about them yesterday. this, I actually took this from some place called Art Photo because it considered so beautiful. It's the plaque from somebody's teeth. And as Steve pointed out, it's about, it's actually several hundred different species of bacteria cooperating with each other to form a biofilm that has advantages and some disadvantages, but net advantages for the organisms that participate. Now this is from Carrie Nadell's my graduate student. This is from a paper we published about 3 years ago together with Kevin Foster and Zhao Xavier. So as a result of this, quorum sensing is to produce, elicit more of these extracellular proteins, produces a slime that eventually allows these biofilms to form. So you go from here to here. Now you have a lot of different kinds of cells. Some of them can make the polymer, some can't make the polymer. We keep track of the extracellular polymers here as well. And as Steve pointed out, some species like Pseudomonas aeruginosa only produce this substance at high slime density. At high cell density. They only start emitting this. And some, like Vibrio, which is the agent of cholera, do exactly the opposite. They produce the substance at low cell densities and then turn it off at high cell densities. So in our paper, we begin to investigate the conditions under which you would expect different strategies to emerge, and we allow all sorts of different strategies. Those who turn it on at low cell densities, those who turn it on at high cell densities, those who we call constitutive that turn it on at any, don't read the cell density at all. What are the benefits of it? Build in the costs, and we watch to see how these, not only how these films grow, but how the different type, under what conditions different types will be selected. So I don't want to go too deep into this, and maybe it's close to what you're going to talk about, Steve, later today, I don't know. But in any case, I'll be happy to send this paper to anyone. If anyone's looking for a really good hire, Carrie Nadell is a great student. Many of the sorts of problems in evolutionary biology involve what we call prudent resource use. That is, not using up the resources as fast as you might. Now, there's a certain level of prudence that you would, if you were just thinking about yourself and discounting for the future. I'm not talking about that. Let's assume you've optimized for that. You still use less than would be optimal for you, and there are a number of reasons you might do it. I'll say a little bit about the evolution of water use strategies in terrestrial systems. More generally, plants don't utilize resources to the maximum level. One reason they may not do it, interestingly, one of my former postdocs published with John Hart on this, is plants may not take up resources too fast because they're farming microbes that they need to fix nitrogen or do other things with the nutrients. If you take it up too fast, then that's bad for the microbes and eventually you'll collapse. My son-in-law's thesis was on the evolution of reduced predation. And I'll say a little bit about the evolution of reduced virulence, but I'll put that actually in another category of the evolution of parasite-host interactions. In all of these, I want to emphasize, and this is from work that Rick Durrett and I did years ago, spatial structure is crucial. That if in well-mixed medium, you often cannot evolve cooperative strategies. They rely on things being viscous, the nearness of other individuals, because you're producing a public good. If it diffuses out for everybody, then you really don't get any net benefit. But if it's localized, then you get more benefits than individuals far away, and if there's a reproductive dynamic, then your offspring are getting it too, your kin are getting it. So spatial structure is extremely important, the localization of interactions, and you can think of lots of analogies to it, not in my backyard types of arguments. This is work that my graduate student Eduardo Zia did. It was his thesis, and he and Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe and I published. We were interested in plants growing in water-limited ecosystems. They're fundamentally limited, let's say, by water, which is carrying the nutrients, and there are a lot of different types, ecotypes, that are there. So plants have a challenge. They have to balance assimilation and evapotranspiration. They do it by controlling their stomata. And they're in some kind of a global commons. So what we did is to compute evolutionarily stable strategies here. And we did this in a situation in which we considered plants distributed spatially, connected only through the water table, and we looked at different levels of mixing of the water table, going from complete mixing, so that all the water is, that you draw up is taken from one big pool, to where everybody had their own pot underneath of them. And not surprisingly, as you increase the mixing rate, the evolutionarily stable strategy of the maximum transpiration rate increases. In other words, if it's a common pool, if anything you save is available to everybody else, you may as well use it up at the maximal rate you can. But the more it's yours, the lower the mixing rate, the more conservative you are in uptake. And this came out very simply from these models, but it won't be a surprise at all to the economists. Now we switch over to the evolution of pathogens. So plants produce allelochemics, that's what's illustrated here, to poison other individuals. And more generally, in parasite-host interactions, parasites are thought to evolve from very virulent forms to much less virulent and ultimately commensal forms, but that's an oversimplification. This is a picture taken in Australia many years ago, where the European rabbit was introduced. And a European rabbit had tremendous effects on the landscape. So this is a fence, and the rabbits were not permitted over here, and the rabbits could live over here. And you can see the dramatic effect. They ate all the people. And then when they're finished with that, they finished off the grass. And so there were massive efforts to control the European rabbit in Australia. By the way, this problem arose elsewhere in Europe in particular. And the way that was done was initially by introducing a virus called myxoma, which causes these lesions on the sides of the rabbits. And they had a lot of trouble getting this to get going because it just wouldn't spread. But there were a number of wet years. It spread by mosquitoes, and the mosquito population built up, and myxoma actually escaped from captivity, basically, and began to spread. And the effect was dramatic. The rabbit populations within 1 year went from about 5,000 per whatever unit area it was, down to less than a tenth of that number. And so dramatic control. Myxoma spread through the population, killed the rabbits, and killed virtually every rabbit it came in contact with. But what happened over the next 6 or 7 years was that the effectiveness was lost. This is the mortality rate of rabbits, and this is the number of epizootics. Epizootics, the term you use if you're not dealing with humans, means epidemics, outbreaks. Essentially means years here, although there might have been 2 in 1 year, and you see it went down dramatically. Now, it went down for 2 reasons. When I mentioned this story to somebody the other day, he said, well, the rabbits develop resistance. And that was true. But the rabbits could not develop resistance initially because the virus killed all the rabbits. And if the virus kills all the rabbits, there's no genetic variance, there's no possibility for selection. But the virus evolved to less virulent forms, and that was the main part of the story. Once that happened, there was some variation in the rabbits, and then there was the potential for the evolution of resistance in the rabbits. And you'll see that in the picture. But why did the virus evolve reduced virulence? Well, because the host is a public good, in a sense. The rabbit, within a host, there is selection for rapid growth and the most virulent types. But the most virulent types kill the host and don't get transmitted to other individuals. And therefore, there's competition within the host for virulence and competition among hosts for transmission. Transmission, of course, is the product of something like the virus titer in an individual and some transmission coefficient. But you need the host to still be alive. So you want a high virus titer so the mosquito comes along and gets a big meal, but you also need it to be alive. Actually, they can spread a little bit afterwards, but that's mainly fleas that do that. But this is a general story, and it's led to the notion among parasitologists that host parasite systems will evolve towards commensalism. Well, that's not true. And you can see that in this picture. This was before you could molecularly identify these things. And so Frank Fenner, still alive, one of the greatest virologists in the world, really documented this. They had rabbits, they had naive rabbits they kept in the laboratory that they would challenge with different viruses. They kept all the different viruses there so they could test it to see whether it was changing the virus or changing the rabbit. And they broke the viral population into different clusters. These are not exactly strict types. They called them grades, based on the case mortality rate among rabbits. Now they could do it molecularly, but this was 60 years ago. And by the way, in case anybody's interested, what's happened since then is they've had to introduce other controls, and things are under much better control now. But the rabbits had broken out epidemically again. Anyway, those that were introduced initially killed almost everyone, 99% of the individuals that were infected. But the weaker grades down here killed almost none, less than 50%, I shouldn't say almost none. And this is the mean survival time of individuals who were infected. So what you see happen is you went from almost everything being grade 1 to much less virulent forms. And I should say that once you get infected, if you're a rabbit, once you get infected with one strain of myxoma, you can't get one of the other strains. There's cross-protection. And so what happened is it evolved towards less virulent forms, but then it stabilized, in part because the rabbits began to develop resistance, pushing things back in the other direction, but also because if you just make an ESS, that's evolutionarily stable strategy calculation, of what the best trade-off is between those two things, it's somewhere in the middle. So, and in case you wondered, it's that cross-protection that means explains why when you got down here, they couldn't just keep reintroducing the virulent form. It wouldn't take. It was the population was immunized, vaccinated by the weaker forms. So this is another way evolution has dealt with one of these sort of common pool stories. Myxomatosis led to the decimation of the rabbit population, but then evolution of reduced virulence compromised success, and then they used new methods to control new viruses, among other control methods. Now let me just lead up to what Avinash is going to say. If you want to think about the dynamics, whether in an ecological and evolutionary context, of contributions to public goods, you have to think about a couple of things. First of all, you have to think about utility functions. What does this consumption mean to me? Secondly, this is a really tough part of the problem, and Avinash will talk a lot about this. You have to think about how public goods affect the utility functions. How do I benefit? How does my utility function affected by what's in the public good? And you have to think about pro-sociality. So I've introduced, and finally you have to think about how individuals are connected to each other, the topologies of social networks. Public goods affect the value of private investment. How much I invest in my kids' education is affected by the library, but how? Don't know, we need data on that. Don't worry, Avinash, I'm not going to write down the equation. Let X be the investment I make in a private good, and then I make an investment in the public good as well. Let capital Z be the total value of the public good. So the utility function is going to be something like U equals X, some function of X and capital Z. But is it additive? Is it multiplicative? Is it more complicated than that? Of course, it depends upon the chart I put up at the beginning, whether we're dealing with rivalrous, excludable, those sorts of things. How this comes in is going to affect this. It's going to depend on the particular good we're talking about. So one of the things we're interested in, if anybody's got any ideas, is getting good data on this. Pro-sociality, as I mentioned at the beginning, is an important contributor. And there are two aspects of this, only one of which we're really going to talk about. One has to do with the consequences of this pro-sociality, and that's what Avinash will develop. And the other is, why are individuals pro-social? Well, Hamilton's explanation explains why you would be pro-social, and maybe you wouldn't even call it pro-social, towards your offspring. And cultural evolution, I think, and norms and things of that sort, explain to some extent why you're pro-social towards other individuals. Pro-social behavior is caring about the welfare and rights of others. There may be some intrinsic prosociality, and there's some recent data suggesting people do care about other people, even unrelated individuals. But otherwise, we have to turn back to things like norms or laws or taxes or incentives that, that create rewards and punishments. Ernst Fair's work will be known to most people here, in which he demonstrates how, through a series of games, how individuals will contribute to public goods, and how this is close to Rob Boyd's talk yesterday, when individuals don't, they're punished for it, and this ends up back in a situation where not only charitable behavior, that is giving to the public good, evolves, but punishment itself begins to develop as a normative behavior. And understanding this is very important to understanding pro-social behavior. I'm going to skip over this, but this is work that my graduate, well, it's actually Carlo Carraro's graduate student, Alessandro Tavoni, but he comes and spends 6 months at a time at Princeton, and my postdoc, Maya Schluer, have been working on, in which we can, looking at common pool resource situations, in which we introduce fitness functions that depend upon some sort of fairness notion. You don't like it when somebody's taking more out than you, but you feel guilty, or else you're punished, when you find that you're taking more out than anybody else. And so we introduce fitness functions. I think I'm going to skip over this. I'll just tell you what it says. Fitness functions which penalize you for extracting more than the norm. So skip over that. Now we'll turn to Avinash, who's going to tell us why individuals contribute to public goods.
Thanks very much. I should emphasize that this is very much work in progress. We have a set of applications in mind, we have a set of formulas, and we are looking for relevant data, etc., that we can turn some of those formulas into actual numbers. Also, maybe some of those applications will require us to reformulate some of the math. Simon actually already gave you a whole lot of potential applications. So in a way, if you want to think of Simon in this context as Einstein and his endless quest for a unified field theory, think of me as one of the calculators that Einstein employed, who kept on doing the calculations, and maybe all this will end up the way their endeavors did, which is, what was it, 36, 37 years of work and no results. But we hope not, and we hope some of you will give us some ideas for it. So pro-socialness, of course, is something that even economists have now recognized as an important fact of life. I want to put it in a perhaps even broader context than that of public goods. Actually, just a brief digression. I myself don't think of dichotomies in the sense of those rivalrous or non-rivalrous, excludable or non-excludable, and 4 boxes anyway. I rather like to think of those 4 boxes as actually comprising a square, where there's a spectrum going by degrees of rivalryness and degrees of excludability, and instead of there being entries in those 4 cells, there'll be points in that square, and they can vary in both dimensions. That's roughly the way I want to do this. And in fact, going a little bit even beyond the context of public goods per se, I want to think in terms of collective action. The number of problems of collective action that societies need to solve in order to achieve efficient economic outcomes or efficient social outcomes. And in many cases, pro-socialness can contribute to achieving better solutions of them, better equilibria. Having just quickly looked at Ted's paper, which will come after lunch, I realized that, in fact, there are further refinements of pro-socialness, and the one I'm talking about is mostly in the context of what he would call love thy neighbor, but he'll explain the other possibilities that exist. It's also a fact of life that pro-socialness is not universal. One feels more pro-social either for kin reasons or repeated interaction reasons, more toward one's family, close neighbors, etc., ethnic groups, fellow citizens, the way kind of civic education, etc., and the concept of citizenship is drilled into people. And full realization of optimal outcomes usually requires something much broader. So something like a really efficient solution to the worldwide climate change problem might require some pro-socialness toward people from other countries, whereas ask a typical American and he or she will say, oh, I don't care about the people in Bangladesh. It's enough to care about people in Florida or wherever. So what we want to look at is how far can localized pro-socialness contribute toward solution of broader, maybe worldwide, public good problems. And we've got a few formulas, few results, etc., that I will very quickly go over. This is an elaboration of the kind of thing that Simon was talking about. We have a number of groups, and each group has a number of members. So XGI will be the subscripted version of Simon's X, the private effort made by person I in group G, and that person will also contribute toward the public effort. So what does group G as a whole get by the way of the public input? It gets not just its own, but maybe spillovers from all the other groups. So this is the total that comes from group H, and of that, a fraction lambda GH, or maybe in some cases it might not even be a fraction, is enjoyed by group G, and so group G gets the uppercase Z for that group will be the sum over all groups of the total in group H times that spillover coefficient. For each person, the X and the Z will produce income, and that will depend in general on the private effort, the public input that's available, and the number of people in the group. And the number of people in the group will reflect the congestion aspect. Simon asked about additivity type issues. I normally like to think of the private and the public inputs as being complementary in the precise sense that the more of the public input that's available, the higher will be the marginal productivity of the private. That's the cross derivative of f between x and g will be positive. And that cannot be captured in the additively separable case. But again, if people have thoughts on that, we can maybe talk about that. I'll put up somewhat special forms of this in just a little while, and you'll see what's going on. Then the income and the cost of putting in the effort will contribute to the ordinary selfish private utility. That will be the income part, minus the cost of the total effort x plus z that the person makes. And we are assuming here that an hour spent in the private cause and the hour spent in the public cause are perfect substitutes. It's the total that gives you disutility or incurs cost. But again, you can do the thing a little bit differently as long as the substitutes qualitative results will go through. And this is the pro-socialness part, which extends only to other members of one's own group. So a person in group G feels prosocial only toward other members of group G, and gamma G is the coefficient that's used in weighting the utilities of the other people. I had already done an application of this that I'll briefly mention to set the stage for this, where there was only one group. So the localness was not an issue. And my question was, how can prosocialness actually be instilled in people by deliberate social conscious choice? And the medium I looked at was educating children. And that's where a lot of this actually goes on. You teach children in kindergarten, etc., that they have to care about the feelings of others, they have to share, all those kind of things. And hopefully some of that sticks in some people. And that's the kind of aspect I was modeling. There I was looking at a public good that I call fully congestible, in the sense that only the average of the z's, the total divided by the number of people, mattered. So the parents pay taxes, the taxes hire teachers, and the teachers then devote their time to socially educating 10 children. If there are 20 children, they'll be able to devote only half the time to each. That's the kind of congestible idea in this context. Doesn't have to be fully congestible in reality, but anyway, that's the model that I had looked at. And then the income of each individual was given by 1 plus the average public input multiplying the person's private input. So in economic terms, there were constant returns to scale to one's private effort, but the existence of the public input enhanced the productivity of private effort. This was the selfish utility, income minus 1/3 x plus z squared. The square creates increasing marginal disutility of effort, and so it's a part of the second order conditions in maximization. The 1/3 was there just to get the solutions worked out nicely. Otherwise, there'd be just messy formulas to replace the numbers I'm going to produce with no change in interpretation. So if individuals were not pro-social, then it turned out that nobody would contribute any private effort in a non-cooperative Nash equilibrium, and incomes would be 3/2 and utilities would be 3/4. Whereas the symmetric optimum, the common level of x and z that would maximize everybody's private social utility, would require each of them to contribute 1 of the public effort, and that would increase the private effort to 2. Remember, these things are complementary, so the more public good there is, the greater the productivity of your private effort, and therefore greater the incentive to make that private effort. And so in the equilibrium, you do make more of it, 2 rather than 3/2, and income then jumps a lot. That's the kind of extra bang that complementarity produces. Of course, you're working harder, so there's disutility of effort, but still the total utility is higher, obviously, because we're comparing an optimum to Nash equilibrium, which typically is not optimum. So how can we go from the Nash equilibrium to the optimum? You could simply, in a command economy, if there was a benevolent dictator, like my friend Joe Stiglitz usually pretends himself to be when he writes about policy, he could simply order people to do this, but that's typically not going to work. And one of the ways in which society is actually trying to do that is to instill prosocialness in people. And that's what I was going to look at, and to start with, looking at what the effect would be if people were prosocial. So let's suppose we somehow instill a prosocialness coefficient gamma that's less than 1. And economists like to give names to assumptions, like the no free lunch assumption. So I call this the no saints assumption. Gamma equal 1 means you would give the same utility to everybody else, that we truly love thy neighbor as thyself. Gamma greater than 1 would be truly saintly. Gamma less than 1 would be love thy neighbor, but not quite as much as thyself. What then happens is that if gamma is too small, given by this, you still get the ordinary Nash equilibrium. This is reminded me of Levin's model of fairness, for example, where the fairness coefficient in utility had to cross a threshold before the equilibrium changed at all. Same kind of thing happens here, unless the prosocialness is, at least at a certain level, no change. It's easier to work in terms of a different parameter that we'll have in our formulas, this phi, it's just 1 over n plus gamma times n minus 1 over n. So this is simply the population-wide average of the weights that each person applies to everybody's utility, 1 to your own, and gamma to the n minus 1 others in the group. And if n is very large, then phi is approximately gamma, because then you are only one of a very large population. And then it turns out the threshold is very simple. It's simply phi less than or equal to 2/3. So ordinary Nash equilibrium, if the purely selfish, if phi is less than or equal to 2/3, if phi is bigger than 2/3, you get a better Nash equilibrium, and you'll see that as phi goes to 1, z goes to, this will be 1, and this will be 1, so 1 over 1 is 1, that was the full optimum. So for phi equal 1, you would get the full optimum. And you can show the utility level, it's constant at the 3/4 level up to phi equal to 2/3, and then increases gradually to the full optimum level 1. So what's happening here is that prosocialness is serving a purely instrumental purpose. The existence of prosocialness is raising people's pure selfish private utilities by making a better equilibrium possible. Of course, if you include the V, then that's a kind of even bigger bang. People feel happier. But even if you leave that out, prosocialness is benefiting them in their pure private role. How to endogenize that? The method I looked at was education, and in a very simple way, the simplest model of reproduction here, each parent has one child, and the whole parent generation will vote on tax policy to educate the children. This is the kind of thing where a parent would not want to educate his or her own child to be prosocial if nobody else is, then that child would just end up being a sucker providing the public good that everybody else enjoys. But you would be perfectly willing to vote for social policy that requires everybody to pay taxes to educate everybody's children, because you know that your own child, among all the others, will benefit thereby. This will require political action. This cannot be done on an individual basis. So then the simplest thing I did was to set up a cost, and T is really for the tax per capita that needs to be paid, to increase the parameter fee. And you need at least the tax K to get any kind of prosocialness at all, and the tax required to push phi to the full value of 1 goes to infinity. So it's really very, very costly to make people fully prosocial. This kind of makes reasonable sense. The big problem with this that I would ultimately like to solve, but it's very hard, is to bring in both uncertainty and heterogeneity in this. I said you educate kids and a little bit of that sticks. So what I would really like to do is to have a population distribution of these phi parameters, not the same for everybody. And what education will do is to shift that distribution rightward in the first order stochastic dominance sense. So there'll be on the whole greater prosocialness, but it will never be perfect. That's the kind of thing I would like to do, but haven't been able to do that mathematically. So I'm going to look very quickly at the purely prosocial, instrumental prosocialness, where the adult cares only about his own private utility and that of his or her own child weighted by delta. So delta is like a discount parameter. Doesn't really care about prosocialness at any level, but is willing to pay taxes to use prosocialness for purely instrumental purposes. The paper on which this is based actually looked at a more comprehensive kind of thing, where the parent also has prosocialness toward others in his own generation, and recognizes that their children will benefit, but they'll pay taxes, etc., with somewhat similar results. But I'll leave people to read that. What then happens is that if the discount factor is below a threshold level, and these are numbers that arise because of all the numerical results, you don't bother. Whereas if it crosses that threshold, then you do vote for policies that will instill prosocialness. And as soon as it crosses the threshold, you instill prosocialness that actually jumps to a level higher than the threshold, discretely higher than the threshold. That's because of that fixed cost K. So once it's desirable for you to overcome that fixed cost barrier, it pays you to go discretely above that. The paper then does all kinds of things, of which I'll just give you a little snippet. What if that discount factor depends on income? And it could depend on income in two ways. It could be an increasing function of income. The real poor are so desperate for survival that they can't afford to engage in prosocial education activities for their children, etc., etc. Or it could be a decreasing function. It could be that the poor are really ambitious that their children should overcome this barrier and have greater incomes in the future. I kind of looked around for evidence as to which one it is from the research on bequests, life cycle saving, etc., but couldn't find any. Nobody's actually bothered to ask empirical questions targeted toward this, but I'm still looking. So what happens then is that the current generation P's income will determine the weight it has, and that will determine its education policy, which will determine the T+1 generation's prosocialness, which will determine its income. Case of increasing, let Y star be the level at which delta crosses the threshold. Delta is an increasing function of Y. So for Y below Y star, delta is below the threshold, and the subsequent generation's income is at the bottom level. Then, as soon as the threshold is crossed, delta, the prosocialness jumps, and after that increases a little bit gradually. So you will get three equilibria. The two end ones are stable. This is a poverty trap. This is a rich one. And somehow or the other, if you can give the current generation incomes higher than Y star, then they'll converge toward, the successive generations will converge toward the upper stable equilibrium. Delta decreasing, then you can get limit cycles. There's a very rich generation that ignores its children. They grow up very selfish and then end up poor. Then they realize, hey, we've fallen very bad times. We can't let this happen to the next generation. They educate them prosocially. They become richer, and you can go on cycling rags to rags in 3 generations and riches to riches in 3 generations. There's kind of local stability type things that you can do, but anyway, so this is where I'll stop with this part, and I'll carry on for a few minutes in the second half and then turn over to Simon. So I think this is a good point to ask questions on things so far to both of us.
For either part.
So,
You want to say whether you're asking Simon or me?
I'm asking you. Well, either one. So it seems to me that prosociality is something that we know exists in societies of all kinds.
Yeah.
A little louder if you could, Rob.
Pardon?
A little louder.
So prosociality exists, I think, in societies of all kinds. I mean, there's, well, ethnographic evidence, and then people have run cross-cultural economic experiments which
Yeah.
suggest that.
In fact, you were part of that.
Yes,
the
I
15th
was
society,
part of it.
yeah.
And it's heterogeneous, but still, even in very simple societies, people show the same kinds of evidences. Some very simple societies are actually among the most pro-social. Well, that's a long story, but and not, I mean, education and institutions that can extract taxes from people are extremely recent inventions. So it seems to me that this is not the kind of model that would provide us an explanation for the more general phenomena of pro-sociality of human society. It's just maybe an increment in
Yeah. No, I have no problem with that. I mean,
Yeah, okay.
I'm not offering this as an alternative to other explanations. I'm, in fact, offering this maybe as a kind of supplement or complement to a lot of them. Religion, although you could think of religion as a part of education in some sense.
well, most religions are not
evolution
pro-social, or
in-
many religions are not pro-social.
In the kind of story that you were telling, the more primitive societies often have an advantage that the groups are smaller and more stable, and therefore there's greater incentive to do this kind of thing. Whereas it's in larger, more mobile societies, etc., that you need more conscious collective effort to educate kids when you know that they might then move to another town or state or what have you. You don't want them to forget that we are all Americans.
Can I add something to that too, since you asked us both, which is, there are really two questions. One of them is, how has pro-sociality evolved? Why do we have it? And the second is, to think of this as a management tool, how could we manipulate pro-sociality? And I think that's the point of view that Avinash took, which is how can we increase pro-sociality? It's a different question. But that's why when I put up my slide, I included things like social norms and customs and things of that sort. So cultural evolution, I think, it explains, and as well as genetic evolution, because it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. It explains why pro-sociality has arisen. And that cultural, but it's, these are not completely unrelated, because that cultural evolution, as you've demonstrated much better than I am, includes why individuals organize themselves into groups, why they derive benefits in those groups, how pro-sociality arises in those groups, and that structure spreads to society. So and when the groups form, they can institute structures that can reinforce pro-sociality. So it's a combination of the two. I think Avinash was directing his question to how can we, as economists, manipulate the system.
Economists up to relatively recently have been discussing this kind of cooperative behaviors as a result of their strategies rather than hardwired preferences. And that's a very strong trend in economics. I tend to agree with you that it's more hardwired. But the question is, to one counter, what kind of evidence can you provide to the economists that in favor of the hardwired versus the strategy kind of?
Actually, I don't know how I would even want to do that, because I'm not thinking of these theories as alternatives anyway. I want merely to argue that, in fact, in this context, wouldn't even want to call it hardwiring. This is really software programming of children. I want to argue that it goes on, and there's a lot of evidence coming both from developmental psychology of the way in which awareness of others, etc., develops in children. In the paper, I make mention of several of these. There is a kind of succession of stages where child will have empathic distress, crying when another child cries, then when they kind of start to become a little bit more aware and can walk around, etc., you see another child crying, this child will bring its own mother to comfort it. Then as it recognizes that other children are different mothers, they'll go and bring the other child's mother to comfort it. And gradually in school, at the ages of like 5, 6, 7, they start to recognize this kind of norms of equality, and then gradually beyond that, empathy, etc., etc. And a lot of this comes from being in school with peers. The role of peers is extremely important, even more so than that of parents. Children are more often likely, it turns out, to bring values from school to home than vice versa. Like children of smokers will usually tell their parents, look, smoking is terrible, you shouldn't be doing this. They don't go to school and say, no, my father smokes and that's just fine. All I would want to argue is that a lot of this goes on in schools, and that is a conscious decision of how much of school time to spend on civic education versus how much to spend on acquiring pure private skills of math or science or whatever that will enable them to go to Wall Street and earn gazillions. I think I don't even want to try to argue that this avenue is the right one and the others are not.
Two things. First, that again from a political theory perspective, the notion that there is a complementarity between private goods and public goods, such that the existence of public goods increases the productivity of private goods production, is a marvelous point. If not because it is potential resolution of the ever bitter debate between conservatives and liberals about what government can do. If one could only persuade all economists to believe that such a complementarity exists, some of the silliness of the talk show radio, et cetera, would be present. So that's the first thing. No, it's not the liberal position. The liberal position is public goods are good, private goods are evil. Okay, and so the position that you've taken is public goods are good because they enable private individuals to pursue private interest in a more efficient way. And that's a different argument than the standard liberal argument. That's one point. Second point question is that the coefficient gamma, the sort of pro-sociology coefficient, comes from not quite the sky, because you've got a model which suggests that there are ways in which to essentially instill pro-sociality through education, through persuasion, through norm development, blah, 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 blah. What I was struck by is that you don't actually relate and maybe you're going to do this in the next part, the pro-sociality coefficient to the relatedness coefficient, the standard kitchen. Maybe the next piece does that. Am I anticipating already what you're
Just
doing?
a little bit. No, not quite.
Because the names that have not come up in the discussion so far are also economists, Alcine and Glaser, and their work on the welfare state, which suggests that the levels of welfare spending in governments are directly related to the ethnic and racial heterogeneity of the population, such that the less money will be spent as a proportion of GDP in essentially racially heterogeneous areas.
Well, in a way, that's what the second half is about.
Yeah, okay, so I'm getting ahead of it. So good. Then let me shut up, because that was exactly what I was saying.
No, actually, you might want to come back, because what I have is not quite that, and just thinking about this in the last few days, I have a conjecture that I'll throw out.
So in general, the framework that I put out would say that you might have a pro-sociality matrix, so that you have I has a pro-sociality in J, which depends on who I and J are. We can't deal with the most general case, but as Avinash is going to set up now, we're at least going to do this by breaking the population into groups. And even in the model he presented, you only feel pro-sociality in the simplest model to individuals in your own group. But you might feel, you could do it that you feel the strongest pro-sociality there and weaker pro-sociality to other individuals.
Usual inclusion measure,
Yeah, so he'll I mean, the framework is there for that. We'll show you some steps in that direction.
One last thing. If that's the case, if that's the framework, then it seems to be the most simple public policy direction to move toward pro-sociality is to increase intermarriage.
Just increase.
And increase rates of intermarriage across groups. And I bet, we can see whether that's right, that if we were to compare attitudes of groups toward one another, that those attitudes, of course, there's multiple causation going on here, would be related to the intermarriage rates.
Polygamy might be.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think
Plus you'll get
that,
hybrid vigor.
yeah, that's a level of social engineering for which you may not find much support. But actually, I'm delighted that you think that the kind of little mathematical formulation I put up has these immense implications. Liberalism versus conservatism, etc.
We'll talk.
Now, if only I could, on my feet, think of a good example from the movies to bear this out. No, a couple of years ago at conference, we had a great exchange of examples from movies. And so, what do you want to do? Do you
Well,
want
since
to
you're continuing
carry
to
on?
speak, and it sounds like some of the
the-
questions or
the-
things you're going to address, they might be good, then they'll be,
Right.
more, rather than have people ask questions, say you're going to address them, why don't we see what you're going to do?
We don't have a scheduled break between these two anyway, right?
Continue until,
Yeah.
until what time?
Well, ideally, if you were done talking somewhere near 11, and
Yeah.
there was
Yeah,
a
that's
discussion
right.
after that.
Yeah, no, that's
And
easy.
you know-
So, do you want to hold it?
I have
Yeah,
one
yeah,
small
yeah.
question. I'm kind of interested in the difference between socialness and social norms, because social norms are not necessarily pro-social.
Yeah.
They're not.
Yeah, that's
So
that's
if the-
norms usually say that you should use such and such. They pertain to actions, whereas this pertains to preferences. And although there may be links between them, they may reinforce each other, they are distinct.
Quickly, go ahead.
Following up on Mysterious' sort of question, is sort of pro-sociality actually in the preference function here really a shorthand for something which is really sort of a norm, which you might be instilling by education, or is it to be taken literally, or is it to be taken as
No, I'm thinking literally. You're kind of altering people's preferences.
Okay.
And that is kind of most easily done at a stage where preferences are in the process of formation anyway, which is why I'm thinking of education of quite young children in this context.
But the preferences may be within the context of economic incentives
Yeah.
that are there to hold those preferences in place.
but it's a sense of sympathy rather than a sense of justice, or
Yeah, this is not a kind of overarching the Kantian imperative or anything like that. Okay, so this is the actual joint work that we are engaged in, and here we found it most useful to have a rather different function that specifies income in relation to private and public efforts. So this is the economist's famous Cobb-Douglas function. Douglas, by the way, for people, non-economists who don't know, is the famous Paul Douglas, who was senator from Illinois for many, many years. and was also a Chicago economics professor for many years before that.
Also, at the age of 50, joined the Marines.
Now that I did not know.
With the,
Yeah.
I don't know, with the war coming out.
Ah. So that's just these two inputs raised to different powers and multiplied together. This has the complementarity property that the greater is the public part, the higher will be the productivity of the private part. But the added thing we have now is the total public input that's available to group G is divided by the number of people in it raised to a power theta. So if theta is 0, then it will be just the total divided by 1. So that will be a fully non-congestible public good. The total quantity is what benefits everybody. Whereas if theta is equal to 1, then that will be a fully congestible good, where only the average of the public input that's available to group G is available to any one member of it. And remember, again, the total that's available is going to be given by the total produced in group H with the spillover coefficient. In the production function, my kind of rough guess is that alpha is going to be pretty close to 1, pretty close to constant returns to private effort. Don't think of it necessarily as labor. It could be a combination of labor and capital, but private capital. And then constant returns is pretty reasonable. I would guess that beta is maybe like 0.1 or so, thinking of the contribution of total capital as being around 30%, and private capital maybe going for 2/3 of that. It's kind of just rough guesses. The important mathematical thing is alpha plus beta has to be less than 2 for second order conditions. The spillovers is what's the kind of interesting thing that's going to allow for various interpretations. So truly global public good like climate, all the lambdas would be 1. Where the total public that's available is just the sum of what's produced in all groups. Now, if you think of climate deterioration as a bad, then you turn the sign around and think of the public good. So think of the total mitigation that's available as the sum of mitigation everywhere. If it's a story of kind of airborne pollution, acid rain type things, then the groups might be countries or what have you going from west to east along the direction of the winds. And what would then happen is that the spillover from group G to group G plus 1 will be particularly high. That to group G plus 2 will be a little bit lower, etc., etc. And the same kind of thing could be done. I mean, in this case, it could be a circular thing right around the Earth, whereas for river pollution, it might be just a finite one-directional chain going from upstream to downstream. Or there could be local effects where G affects G plus 1 and G minus 1. Now, the thing that's not done in this, and that pertains to Bernie's question, is that the gamma applies only to one song group. You may spill over things to other groups, but you don't care about them. And that at one time we did because we thought it kind of pretty realistic, but maybe Americans do care a little bit about Canadians, even though they may not care much about Bangladesh, this kind of thing. And my conjecture is that if you have a similar kind of gamma GH, a correlation between gamma GH and lambda GH would be quite important for a good solution to the public good problem. If the localness is such that you care precisely about those people to whom you spill things over. And one of the things I hope to do is to modify those formulas and see if correlation comes out in a nice way. Then the same kind of utility functions, and then what we did was solve all this out, and then in all cases, completely generally, we have enough and the right kind of equations, etc., so the system is determinate, and ultimately we'll end up doing numerical solutions soon as we have some idea of what numbers to put into it. There are a couple of cases where we can get explicit analytical solutions, and one is where the spillover thing is separable. So lambda GH is a product of a lambda H that comes from group H and a mu G that goes to group G. So these might be in a kind of relatively equal levels of incomes per capita. We just relate it to populations. So a very populous country pollutes a lot, and a very populous country, a large country likewise ends up getting a lot of pollution. There are various interpretations possible. So you do all that, and then it turns out that ZG is actually, there's a typo here, this should be a mu G, not a mu H, times T, and we get a very complicated solution for T. So this is kind of boring to display compared to lovely pictures, but this is the kind of thing that we ultimately hope to end up putting numbers into. And what we'd love to get is ideas on where we can get those numbers and what we do with them. And with that, Simon will have some more ideas and questions.
I mean, one place you'd like to find some numbers that would be of interest is there's a group by Kip Viscusi who asked people, he proposed a hypothetical disease, described the symptoms in some detail, and asked people, what would you pay to not get this disease yourself? Then he asked, this was asked to somebody, it was in North Carolina, what would you pay, then what would you pay for, so that everybody in the state of North Carolina would not get this? And, you know, it was about twice what you paid to not get it yourself, or something like that. And then, what would you pay so that everybody in the United States would not get it? And it was just a little bit more than what you paid in North Carolina. And then, what would you pay so that everybody in Georgia would not get it? And then the modal answer was, nothing, they ought to pay for it themselves.
And for everybody in Massachusetts, were they willing to pay negative sums?
Right.
Did they
Anyway, I thought it was nice of you to have that.
Did they ask the question of what would you pay to eradicate the disease?
They didn't ask it that way. You know, they had some, I've forgotten the framing, but it was, you'd inform, there was some, I think it was, you had a little medicine that would prevent it, and then maybe it was an educational campaign that prevented from
Did you give the reference?
It's Kip Viscusi, and I'll send you a reference.
That sounds like a great point. So the question I was getting in terms of eradication is because then you might be thinking about future generations as well.
Yeah, they didn't ask.
And I'm wondering if there were, what would you pay to make sure that your children didn't get it?
Yeah, right. They did ask nice questions, or there's a related literature where they asked mothers, what would you pay so your children won't get this or that disease? And then what would you pay so you wouldn't get it yourself?
Yeah.
And quite naturally, the mothers are willing to pay more so that for their children not to get it themselves. The mother suffers as much.
They didn't
So-
ask the fathers.
And fathers, yeah.
Okay, we've been looking desperately for sources, and you know, I think Avinash maybe is more optimistic than I am. I've sort of become convinced that it's going to require some sort of partnerships where we actually now try to go out and get the data rather than digging them out of the literature. So let me just give you a couple of aspects. Avinash introduced basically the spatial aspects of this, or if you prefer, the network aspects, because it doesn't have to be spatial. Individuals could be broken into ethnic groups or other sorts of social networks. One place we've looked is in climate change agreements. I've sent Avinash a lot of papers some of the best papers I found on this, and his analysis of them is they're mainly trash. Is that? I won't
It
get.
was a private rather than a public statement.
that are seriously deficient.
But there isn't much out there. I mean, climate change is a really good place that you might think about applying these ideas, and there isn't much out there. I'll say a little bit about the control of antibiotic resistance, which is close to what you're talking about. We're working with my colleague Dan Rubenstein on a real global commons problem in terms of the pastoralists that he's dealing with in Kenya and how they graze their flocks, and we have some, or herds, dependent. And I think there's some potential for really making some progress there. Small fisheries are obviously a good example. I showed that work with my student, and Lynn Ostrom's work obviously holds some potential here. I've started a project with Steve Lansing, who may be known to some of you, who is well known for his work on the water temples of Bali. These are water distribution systems. He published a book called Princeton Programmers, in which he showed that these systems have been managed largely through the role of religious figures in the system. The government came in and found out that this is a very inefficient system, computerized it all, put new measures in place, and the whole system collapsed. So then he went back and he modeled this as a self-organizing system. Anyway, we have a grant proposal to look at this. And maybe some of the evolutionary examples that we'll hear more about later today, and some of which I'll come back to. It may be a different sort of place to get these data. Climate change obviously raises multiple public goods problems, largely dealing with different nations as major players, and the things that Avinash hinted to. And Lynn Ostrom talks about this in a paper. I don't know if she's published yet. She sent it to a number of us when she finished it some months ago, arguing for the need of a spatially structured, basically, approach to the problem where you get cooperation within groups and then scaling up. So that won't surprise you coming from Lynn, but it also, I think, fits right into this framework. Let me say a little bit about antibiotic use. You probably are aware that, everybody's aware that antibiotic resistance is a growing problem. The effectiveness of antibiotics is declining. We aren't really producing new antibiotics. There haven't been any new antibiotics on the market in decades. There are technically new antibiotics, but they are just slight variants on the old mechanisms, no new mechanisms. So we're in trouble there. And part of the problem is because it's a spatial structure. Hospitals and communities create what we call a metapopulation framework. You go from hospitals to cities to nursing homes, et cetera. And spatially explicit strategies are going to be important here. This shows you what's happened with the drug-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. This is the major initial concern. This is the percent that are resistant. This was in 1976. This was in 1992. You see this dramatic rise. And the other thing you'll notice is that these are big hospitals and these are smaller hospitals. The larger the hospital, the bigger the problem has become. This is methicillin-resistant MRSA. Everybody's heard about MRSA. And I don't have you a similar slide to show for the effects of city size, but you get a similar effect in the big cities have bigger problems. So with Ram Lakshmanarayan and David Smith, who used to be a student of mine and now works with Ram, we set out to look at this, and Ram and I just had a conference call with John List, who many of you will know, the other day, and the three of us are going to start. The question is, how do you change doctors' prescribing behaviors? How are doctors' prescribing behaviors guided by the norms of the hospitals they're in, where they did their residencies, et cetera? How do you manipulate that? And John is one of the best people at doing field experiments in economics, so and we've got some money to look at this, so we're really hopeful to get some data out of that. But let me tell you the sorts of things that Ram and David and I published. We considered a game among hospitals. So the idea is, basically, if you're in a small city, one hospital, you send the patient home, that patient gets sick again, patient comes back and sees you. In a big city, you send the patient home, may come back to you, may go to another hospital or someplace else. In the small city, the patient you discharge is your problem if it comes back. If that patient is carrying antibiotic-resistant bacteria, they're going to bring it back to you. So you have more interest, the idea is, in making an investment in antibiotic in control. And there are straightforward ways. Small countries have done this too. Small, I can't remember if it's Denmark or Holland. I think it's Holland. But one of those countries introduced measures and knocked antibiotic-resistant bacteria way down below 10%. So you can do it in small cities, and there are measures, simple measures in terms of the procedures individuals on the nursing staff, for example, and the doctors use. So what we do is we set up a model which has a number of hospitals, and we set up a utility function and ask what's the optimal investment that you should make in terms of your payoff for a single hospital, and then we put that in a framework with a mixed hospital with discounting of future, because those patients won't come back for a while, and compute the game theoretic strategies. And it won't surprise you to note that the investment that you make in antibiotic resistance decreases with city size because of the patients you discharge are less likely to be your problem. I won't go through the mathematics, but what you do is you devise the conditional payoff to you as to what the optimal investment would be as a function of the average investment by other hospitals, and then you assume some symmetry to get the game theoretic optimum. So that might be one place. I mentioned the common pool resources, like in the lobster fisheries or other small fisheries. And now I want to mention an evolutionary example that I didn't mention in the first half, except in passing, allelopathy, which is the production of chemicals that hinder other individuals. And one of the best examples has to do with E. coli that you're all harboring in your gut. E. coli and other bacteria poison their neighbors, and that poison is a public good. This is well understood, and a lot of the work on this had been done by Bruce Levin, no relationship to me, doesn't even know how to pronounce his last name, and his students at now Bruce is at Emory, especially Lin Chow, who worked with him. Lin Chow is at San Diego, at trying to see if they could evolve the production of this chemical, which is called colicin when you're dealing with E. coli. And they had a lot of trouble doing this in a well-mixed medium because cheaters kept arising who had resistance to the colicin production, but didn't bother producing colicin themselves. So they're paying, in a sense, half the price. I have no advantage, if I'm a colicin producer, I have no advantage over these cheaters because they have resistance. And so they couldn't, they had trouble evolving them. But the trouble is that although the cheaters, which is here indicated as the resistant type, have an advantage over the colicin producers, and the colicin producers have an advantage over the wild type actually has an advantage over the resistant type because the resistant type's not producing anything. It's paying some price to have this resistance. And so in competition between the colicin producer, between the wild type and the resistant type, the wild type, means that's the type that doesn't have any of these chemicals, wins out. So you get this classic non-hierarchical competition scheme where the colicin producer rock, paper, scissors outcompetes, and Mark Feldman and Ben Kerr and their group, Brendan Bohannon published a paper actually following up on our model. This is a model that I'm going to tell you about that Rick Durrett and I developed following Levin and Chow. And Bohannon's group did experiments and actually demonstrated that this works. The colicin producer has an advantage over the wild type. The wild type has an advantage over the resistant type. The resistant type has an advantage over the colicin producer. In a well-mixed medium, you get oscillations. But what you get in a spatial grid, I emphasized that before, is that these three types chase each other around. You get patches of one displaced by the one can outcompete it, displaced by the one can outcompete it. And these coexist essentially indefinitely. And Bruce Levin and Lin Chow, I think it was Lin Chow's thesis, actually did this experiment initially instead of letting things be in a well-mixed medium, they put it on a grid and on a gel. And in that situation, they were able to get the evolution of these strategies. So one of the things you learn from this is not only cooperative behavior, but this sort of spiteful behavior. But the spiteful behavior is the production of the public good, namely the chemical, can evolve, but it requires spatial structure to do it. So more generally, this goes back to what the sorts of questions that Rob asked before. Where does prosociality come from? And again, I'll emphasize that one goal can be to instill prosociality by laws, etc. But the other, from an evolutionary point of view, you want to know where does the prosociality come from, and that is actually tied up with the question of where do groups come from. And I'm not going to answer that, but just refer back to the literature on norms, etc. Some of it comes, this goes back to your question, from genetic relatedness. So there's a prosociality that's built in for reasons going back to Hamilton. There's recent evidence that I alluded to that individuals may show genetic tendency for cooperation with other individuals, and that's really recent work, so I can't comment on how well accepted that is, but I think we all would accept that to some degree, and people have a prosociality towards other individuals. The question is, how strong? Luckily for Avinash, it's less than 1. Because he didn't mention to you that the reason we did, if it's greater than 1, the mathematics all blows up. And social norms and customs and things of that sort that evolve. And laws and taxes. So I'll go back to this issue I raised before. Avinash talked about congestion, which were these two different cases. And I just want to say about that, in my last comments, and then I'm going to quit, I want to follow up on something that I said in the first half, which is in distinguishing between these two cases, it might make a difference. It doesn't. It may not appear to make a difference if you just write down differential equations that say the proportion of the population. If you lump all the individuals together and say they reproduce by a certain fraction, you're not keeping track of whether you've got twice as many twice as many smaller individuals or half as many. Never mind, you know what I mean. But and everything we've talked to you about so far is this sort of Eulerian approach, where you keep track of the number of individuals in the population. But what if some of these populations are small? Or what if so we didn't have any stochasticity in our models. What if you took an individual-based approach? I just want to go back to some older work to say if you took an agent-based model, where every individual was built in, we can't do that yet. It could make huge differences. So this is the last frontier. Space. Rick Durant and I set out some years ago to understand how spatial structure or other kinds of structure could enhance cooperative behavior, and as you just saw, could enhance selfish behavior more generally. And one thing we learned is the way you build space in can make a big difference. So I'm just going to close with this sort of caveat by giving you some examples. On a large grid, you may just develop diffusion approximations, and they work pretty well. But as I'm going to show you, you've got to be careful how you derive those diffusion models. Agent-based models can give you very different consequences from these lumped models, either the diffusion models or the sorts we talked about, because of small number effects if your prosociality is very local. So what we just consider, this is the framework for an agent-based model or an interacting particle system, which I'm going to do here on a grid. But you can also do this with individuals moving around in a continuum. So I'm going to break up this grid into boxes, into cells, and imagine this on a torus, so individuals on the edges are connected. That's just for mathematical simplicity. So everybody's got, these guys are neighbors with these guys, and et cetera. And I'm going to have two types. I'm going to call them hawks and doves. They won't fit in the usual notion of that, but it just so gives me something to talk about. And eta sub t and zeta sub t are the numbers of hawks I'm sorry, Anus of D is the number of hawks in one of these squares. In particular, it's a function of x, it'll be the number in the square centered at x, x is a vector, at time t. And this mathematics here says it's a mapping. Here, it's actually the number, these are the real number, make these the integers here. This will be the number of hawks in a square of psi 1 centered at x and time t. So the important thing here is it's 0, 1, 2, 3. It's not 10 to the minus 9 individuals. So we're going to keep track actually of individuals. And I'll do the same thing. Zeta of t will be the number of doves. Now, there are a couple things that go on. Individuals can move from square to square with a certain probability. And we're eventually going to take limits, so that's scaled down as you would for standard limit. And rate mu, an individual changes its location. Individuals also die. They have and the death rate we actually allow to depend on density dependence, and it may depend on a neighborhood as well. So individuals have a migration neighborhood. They have a neighborhood at which their death is concerned, and most importantly, they have a gain neighborhood. So there are 3 different neighborhoods here. They could all be the same, but they don't have to be. So if this is the number of hawks in one cell, this is the average proportion of hawks in the neighborhood. And the average, and we can vary the size of that neighborhood to go everywhere from the smallest neighborhood up to the whole grid. Each individual experiences a payoff. Here we call it a birth rate, which is a weighted average of the proportion of hawks and the proportion of doves in their neighborhood. So this is the gain step, and the payoffs are A and B, and similarly the doves get payoffs C and D. So we have an interaction matrix A, B, C, and D. And if we wrote down the mean field dynamics for this, this is what we assume it would look like. The rate of change over time, so time is continuous here. The rate of change over time of the hawk population per capita is the weighted average of its payoffs, where U and U plus V is what's going on in that neighborhood. That neighborhood now being the whole grid, because this is, mean field means you see everybody, minus a density-dependent death term, again, mean field. So these are the set of equations. You could essentially solve these equations exactly. They're extremely nice, and I won't go through the math. Another thing you can do is to introduce what would typically be done in building spatial models. You can introduce space just by adding diffusion terms onto these. I'm going to show you that's the wrong thing to do. Usually that's the wrong thing to do. So just add diffusion terms on here, and we'll assume both of them have the same diffusion rates. So the first case, I'll tell you, is bistable competition. Remember, Avinash gave you a case in which there were 2 possible outcomes, and Rob showed us a case yesterday where it was bistable competition. This picture's not so good, but because I guess you can't really see the dove. That's a dove down there, and that's a hawk. So the idea is, in this case, there are 2 kinds of birds competing for a resource. Whoever gets there first does better. If a hawk meets a hawk, they all do it. Maybe I shouldn't call them hawks and doves, but just think this as 2 kinds of birds. If A meets A, they get a high payoff. If B meets B, they get a high payoff. But if A meets B, then they both suffer. Okay, so the interaction matrix looks like this, something like this, with a dominant diagonal. And there are 2 possible outcomes. If you start here, you end up here, all hawks. If you start here, you end up here, all doves. Now, we've heard several examples of those kinds of dynamics. What happens if I put this on a grid? If I put this on a grid, we find that where you're only interacting locally, there are 2 time scales. On the fast time scales, individuals organize themselves into groups, and then those groups fight with each other on a slower time scale. This is what we call contingent competition, and you see eventually these blue guys are going to disappear, and we've worked out lots of details of this, of the effects of the size of the grid, starting conditions, etc. But what I want to emphasize to you is in the mean field model, which is what I showed you, you get exclusion. One type or the other wins. It's contingent on what the initial conditions are. If you take the metapopulation, which is what Avinash presented you have a bunch of cells and they interact with each other, you get contingent exclusion as well. But just like we've got in the mean field model. If you build the interacting particle system, what you saw happens is you get exclusion, but it turns out not to be contingent on initial conditions for generic condition. And let me go back and show you why that is. What happens is that locally this dynamic defines what's going on, and then once you have the groups, the only things that matter are the diagonal terms, and the one that's got the bigger diagonal term here takes over. And so you always get the same outcome unless you created probabilities zero, measure zero initial conditions in which this type wasn't represented. But generically, you always get the same outcome. So they're different. And if you look at the reaction diffusion equations that you get just by slapping the diffusion term on, you get exactly the same thing as the interacting particle system. So it works well. The reaction diffusion limit matches the interacting particle system. But now consider a modified situation, and again, I apologize for these pictures. What this is supposed to show you is that if a hawk meets a, this is closer to the standard hawk-dove thing, but it's still different. If a hawk meets a hawk, they fight over the resources. One of them gets it, maybe, but they're all damaged, and you end up with a smaller payoff, smaller hawk. Hawk meets dove, hawk always wins. Dove always loses. Dove meets dove, everything's copacetic. They share a bottle of Francisco's wine. Everybody's fine, and this payoff here, you get two doves. So that's the highest payoff. So what does that payoff matrix looks like? Well, it looks something like this. Hawk versus hawk will give a negative payoff too. Dove versus hawk does even worse. Hawk versus dove does great. Dove versus dove does well, got a positive number, but not as good as hawk versus dove. So this is what, if Eric Maskin were here, he talked about as a dominated strategy. Hawk always does better than dove. But it's more complicated than that, because what happens is that the hawks drive, you get these homoclitic orbits. Hawks drive doves extinct, and then hawks only have themselves to deal with, and that's a negative number, so they go extinct. So the whole system collapses. So what happens if you put this on a grid? First of all, let me tell you that simply adding diffusion terms doesn't alter the outcome, but the system crashes. So the reaction diffusion equation here doesn't help you much. The system still collapses. But things are quite different in an individual-based model, because what happens here is similar to what happened in the Collison example. Hawks drive doves extinct, hawks die out, but then doves with that positive thing are able to migrate in and come in and take over, and the system basically persists forever, modulo the fact it's a finite grid, so it can't persist forever. But the larger the grid, the larger it persists. And so you get coexistence because of the localization of interactions. Not well captured by, certainly not by the mean field model or by the diffusion model. So this individual-based model, what's going on is what I just described here to you. So doesn't mean you can't take a diffusion limit, but you better be careful how you do it. So we did this in a rigorous way, letting those terms shrink to zero and trying to figure out what the reaction terms were. And if you do that, I think I already said this, but no, I didn't give you all this. In the mean field model, you get system collapse. In the reaction diffusion model, you get collapse. You get persistence in the interacting particle model. And it happens here, if you go to the metapopulation model, you actually get the right answer. But you don't know that in advance. So simply adding diffusion terms naively may give you the wrong answers. You have to derive continuum limits by rigorous processes. So you allow this, it's called hydrodynamic limits. You allow the cell size to shrink to zero. You scale the migration rates as you will, deriving the diffusion equation. And then you have to make some assumptions, because the interacting particle model is based on 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 individuals. So you have to translate the density that you're going to get into the probabilities of seeing 0, 1, 2, 3. And one way to do it is by assuming local densities are Poisson. If you do that, you can get limits. And they look something like this, and this is as ugly as some of Avinash's slides. But the point is here, to emphasize to you, you still get a standard diffusion term, and there might be a diffusion coefficient out in front of it. But it's the reaction terms that change. And the reaction terms change in a way that tell you if you have a low density of individuals, they really have no effect of what's going on. So you get a much more complicated local dynamic that really then begins to capture the features of the interacting particle system correctly. So this last part here was just sort of a caveat that we're going to get as far, and everybody who's developing these sorts of models will get as far as we can get with these average population density models, but be aware that individual-based simulations might give different results, especially in a spatial situation in which local densities become small. Because even if individuals are common, locally they may be rare, and that may be important for how particular types get going. What's going on in the example I gave you is that in the reaction diffusion model or in the well-mixed model, doves just can't get a head start because with assuming diffusion, hawks have an infinite speed of propagation and they get everywhere instantaneously and they take over. But in the spatially structured model, what's really going on is doves colonize an area and they have a little time to build up before the hawks get to a level that matters. And in the proper limit, that's taken account of because hawks at low density ended up not mattering. So I'll quit there. Yeah, Steve.
First, a very short technical comment, which we don't need to go into. But if you do a reaction diffusion type system, and you just use a truncation point, so that when things are of low density or frequency, it wouldn't be 1/10 of 100th of an individual. You just call that not an individual. You can.
That's right.
Come some way towards it. That's just a technical issue, though. Some reason.
Well, let me comment on that first, which is you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But the point of doing it this other way is we don't have to make an a priori assumption about what the level should be.
No, I understand.
So what this does is it takes the diffusion limit and it tells you basically what that level should be. But that's effectively what's happening.
Yeah. So technically, I mean, so that's the disadvantage of the individual-based stochastic model is that technically you have to do a lot of runs and it's a lot of work. And so actually doing both is usually the best thing to do because you get the inside of the equations and you get the sort of more accurate description of natural history from the individual-based.
But this technique we developed for developing the limit is something I think can apply to all those sorts of models.
Okay, so I agree with that. But I think the question I really wanted to ask was in relation to Barry's question from the first half, which that was quite an interesting point, was he talked about what I would prefer to call synergism between the individual and public levels. And he made the point very clearly, I just want to come back to it, because in the biological models you get that synergism, happens all the time. And you made the point that that's something that's just not discussed or usually not paid attention to, or maybe it's a key point of leverage with regard to understanding how we might look at these models and find a place where we could find something interesting. And so I just found it interesting because I just always assume that there's that kind of synergism because if you write down a simple biological model, it happens. And so it would be interesting to know empirically in human social systems whether that interaction has been ignored because empirically it's not reasonable or just because there's a conceptual gap in the way people are looking at things. And maybe there's some real insight there. So.
I mean, again, I had more or less assumed that complementarity exists.
Yeah.
And haven't even bothered to look for hard empirical evidence.
But the implication is that
the kind of
You're not.
There is actually two books by Peter Linder that UC Davis was,
Who was that?
Peter Linder at UC Davis, 2004 and 2005, that makes the argument something that for the advantage of the West, sort of especially around the turn from the 19th to the 20th century, that made a huge difference. And empirically, if you see that higher income is correlated with higher share of the public sector, so both local and that's very robust. So empirically, I think this is pretty good. I mean, there will be people who will dispute that. but there is very little.
But I think we're missing something that people have known a long time, which was, I mean, in a lot of the stuff you do, stereos. I mean, the notion of a rule of law, having courts enforcing, these are all publicly provided, and they form the basis for private exchange. So the people for years have understood there's a complementarity. I mean, I guess where they disagree is to the extent to which the complementarity exists, and in what domains of life. But I think for a long time, I don't think it's that absurd an assumption to assume there's a complementarity. I think you can make that assumption and be pretty confident in that. That'd be my
I would.
We didn't feel
When
absurd.
you say a long time, that's a long time relative to your life. It's not actually a long time relative to my life. Within economics, it's a relatively recent development to acknowledge, for example, that the rule of law is an absolutely critical feature in understanding economic development. It's not that they don't now acknowledge it, it's just that if you go back a ways, they didn't.
Well, actually, I think that's what more because they just took it for granted that law existed and supported economic activity till they started to look at what was happening in foreign socialist economies where there had not been a tradition and they're trying to get growing and it wasn't often working, or in less developed countries where
But is it also the case that people accept it and yet ignore it at the same time? Because they'll accept it at one level of society, and yet when the new problems arise, and they know that the solution existed in one aspect of society, like courts or something like that, but they have a new challenge like education that they ignore what they already know, which is what leads to a lot of debate. That's what I took as your point. Is that, on the one hand, it's not that it's not known that it exists, but on the other hand, it's when the solution is staring us in the face from things we already know work, we don't necessarily pay attention to it. And so the interaction of theory that shows that it could work along with a better understanding of the scope of these empirical issues would seem to me like a strong point of leverage, because it's a key. Everything turns on that issue. No matter, I mean, you can build the whole models up and eventually, but eventually, that's sort of the main point around which things turn. And it's a simple point, but it might be very widespread in the degree to which people disagree about its scope.
and very often in public debates, so where you want to distinguish yourself from the rival's position, there's kind of incentives to polarize too much. I don't know what would happen if you really pin down some of these debaters in private. What do you really think?
Money spent on the government is money taken from the people.
Well, that's a strong anti-complementarian point.
And waste.
And conversely, on the liberal side.
Yeah.
It's sort of a speech. It seems to me that a lot of the discussion this morning emphasizes the sort of rosy side of pro-sociality. And I mean, there's always competition for resources like matters. And it seems to me that one of the big effects of pro-sociality is to increase the scale on which competition occurs. So in all these models, the groups are just bouncing against each other. But what really happens is that, I mean, I think by far the most common form of pro-social behavior in cross-culturally in small-scale societies, probably big-scale societies, is war, right? It's stealing from your neighbors. And anything that increases our willingness to cooperate with our friends and neighbors also increases our ability to organize ourselves to steal from our more distant neighbors. And I think this is really something that is important to keep in mind all the time, because I think that it's, as a matter of fact, I think that you can see that if you imagine there's only one, was it gamma that was the arc, but in fact, I think it's really quite easy to organize people patriotically, right? When war starts, and people race off to war, and people push their kids out the door, go join the army. And getting them to do other things like pay taxes or solve global warming is much more difficult. So I'm inclined to think that we may have more specific domain-specific psychology that makes us more easily motivated pro-socially towards things which we have a long history of pro-social.
So I agree with you entirely. That's a speech I often give. In fact, I've given here, arguing that if you think about how does cooperation emerge, the easiest cases are ones where there's close genetic relatedness.
Yeah.
And you work up from there to reciprocal altruism, and then it's easy to explain cooperation in small groups. But that often the cooperation in those groups is based on competition with other groups and banding together. And the question is, A, how do you scale that up to bigger and bigger societies? How do we achieve it at national levels? How do we achieve it internationally? And is there a way that we can regard that environmental degradation, for example, is another group, it's the enemy? And there are many difficulties in doing that. One of them is that the larger the group gets, the less the relatedness, the less the recognition, and they're hydrodynamic features that would cause groups to break apart. But I think that's the challenge that we face in climate change. There's no disagreement. But I see that that's what Lynn Ostrom is sort of addressing herself to, build the cooperation in the small groups and then find ways for those to interact with each other. Don and I went to a meeting, I don't remember if anybody else was here, at the Santa Fe Institute on complex systems approaches to international relations, where with people like Bob Jervis and others there, we had the question is, if you have lots of countries, how do you build agreements? And I think, at least my point of view was, I'm pretty sure it was Don's, that you start by building bilateral agreements and small associations and you build up from there. So that's why when I showed that slide, I just showed the US and Chinese leaders, because I think you start, you start there and then you have to work up. But I agree with you, that's the big challenge, and I don't have a particularly rosy view of it.
Yeah, actually, in fact, I'll go even further. My objective is to ask how far can you get with somewhat localized pro-socialness when a full solution needs global one and you can't have that. In fact, I also agree with the kind of multidimensional aspect of this, and to the extent that local cooperation is maintained as a repeated game equilibrium. A repeated game equilibrium is going to be better if the consequences of deviation are going to be worse. So in that context, it's almost important for a kind of sense of usness to produce a good outcome, that there be others there on whom it would be terribly bad to fall back. So if you don't behave well within the in-group, you will be thrown on the mercy of the out-group. And kind of fierceness to a warlike situation, if you like, or hatred between out-groups seems almost a good thing for sustaining good outcomes in the in-group.
There's quite a bit of evidence from social psychology that if you mobilize people will cooperate in almost any kind of group, but if you put the groups in competition or anything like that, it enhances this effects.
So you just give artificial levels of blue and red.
Well, that gets cooperation, but now if you say your payoff is it depends on the difference between you and the reds, you're blue, then you get a lot more cooperation, even though if you write down their game theoretic model, there's no difference.
Yeah.
Completely different. Has anyone considered the possibility, you said you didn't actually particularly like most of the literature dealing with sort of climate change, etc., but have you seriously considered the possibility of allelopathy in that context? Because, I mean, we think of this from an economics point of view, where you think of global goods as public bad, but you think of it from an international relations point of view, the effects are going to be heterogeneous. And if countries think in terms of comparative advantage rather than competition, rather than in terms of sort of like simple sort of global utility or individual utility function.
We're suggesting poisoning our neighbors.
I tackle the fact that global warming actually good for. I mean, if you have a large frozen landmass, global warming may not be bad at all. Yeah, there is the possibility of comparative advantage with neighbors.
That's probably in fact how they're behaving.
I'm somehow reminded of a movie, Canadian bacon. Have you seen that? Where the U.S. economy is in a mess, and the president decides we have to have war with somebody.
Oh, yes, yes.
You can't interest the Russians and the Chinese. And so he declares war on Canada. And my favorite scene is these guys driving up there with Canada sucks all over their car and get stopped by the police, who say they're violating the law by doing that because it has to be also in French.
So, following up on Rob's and Avinash's point about the issue about war, it's interesting that which sort of creates this publicness, the idea of a public good and altruism, at least in the European, in the national states, what we have is very close to what Avinash said. I mean, basically, public education, the public education of turning sort of French peasants into Frenchmen, took about a long time, a century or something. But then that resulted and that happened throughout Europe, and then it resulted in the First World War and the Second World War. What is interesting now is that I was struck, so in the last 20, 25 years, you have all this constant propaganda about the European identity, the sort of in schooling, you do have the same thing, constructing sort of we are all Europeans or something like that. And that suggests that's the primary mechanism.
Well, I think it's an answer part to Rob's question, but it may not work because it can lead to wars.
That's right.
Or it could lead to cooperative, but
So it stops only at the global level, what you're doing.
so the question is, can you keep people in line and then get them to join groups and to build up and to keep that going until you get to the international level? Do you want to take the last question?
Since you've been talking a lot of topologies and connectivity, you don't think that this might be a big jump, but you don't think that the increase in connectivity helps the size of the group getting bigger, or because you spoke of them mean field.
Well, I mean, remember, the increase in connectivity has multiple effects, and remember, the last examples I showed you, one of the things the increase in connectivity does is it makes everything a well-mixed organization, and it was much harder to illustrate, to evolve, well, it's much harder to evolve cooperative behavior in a well-mixed group than in one where you're interacting with your neighbors and you develop implicit reciprocal altruism. You may not even recognize your neighbors, but you can assume that evolution assumes that your neighbors are paying you back. So clumps of cooperators develops, etc. So viscosity, that sort of turns out to be very important for the evolution of cooperation. So my view is that if you go to more and more mixing, you may find it harder to sustain cooperation because everything becomes more diffuse.
That's interesting connecting these days because with the internet and communication, the communication network is becoming much.
Yeah, of course there are different topologies that are going on in these models, and not to say that all aspects of the interconnectedness are bad. It has a homogenizing influence, and that can be both good and
we can see in social life outside there's an homogenizing effect.
Should we take the coffee break now, Steve? Is that what's supposed to happen? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, 10 after, 20 after, plus or minus.
I think everything is right here.